They called it the Jug, short for juggernaut. At first glance, it looked absurd, fat, overweight, clumsy. When German pilots first encountered the P-47 Thunderbolt, they laughed. Compared to the sleek and deadly Messerschmitt Bef 109 or the Focke-Wulf 190, the American machine looked like an ungainly brute, more barn door than bird of prey. But those laughs would not last. Because beneath its heavy frame lurked a beast, armed with 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, capable of spitting out 100 rounds per second. Enough to shred through the toughest German fighters, rip apart convoys, and even tear locomotives from their rails. By the end of the war, the P-47 would become one of the most feared aircraft in the skies over Europe, claiming thousands of Luftwaffe kills and turning the tide in the battle for air superiority. Yet its journey to respect was not instant. Pilots had to learn how to master its weight, its quirks, its strange silhouette. Many paid the price in fire and steel. One American flyer wrote in 1943, "When I climbed into the Jug, I thought she signed kill me before the Germans ever had a chance. But once I opened the throttle and felt her dive, I realized she wasn't ugly, she was unstoppable." This is the story of how a laughingstock became a legend, of how German aces underestimated a machine that could not only fight but endure, and of the men who strapped themselves inside, knowing they were flying into a storm of flak, fire, and death. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, the warplane the Germans learned to fear. But to understand how it earned its place among the great warbirds of history, we must go back to the skies of 1942, when the Allies were desperate for an answer to the Luftwaffe's dominance. German pilots laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt until its 8.50s reigned lead on them. By 1942, the skies over Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, forged in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War and sharpened during the Blitzkrieg campaigns, was the most experienced and deadly aerial armada on the planet. Its pilots were veterans with hundreds of combat missions, many already celebrated as experten, aces with kill counts that dwarfed anything the Allies could claim. The Messerschmitt Bef 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 sliced through the air with deadly grace. German engineers had perfected the balance of speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Against them, the Allies struggled. Britain's Royal Air Force had fought them to a standstill during the Battle of Britain, but only barely. Army air forces, still building their strength, faced a brutal reality. If America was to launch daylight bombing campaigns over Europe, they needed fighters that could escort their bombers deep into enemy territory and survive. But in 1942, the available fighters, the P-38 Lightning and the P-39 Airacobra, were not enough. The Lightning struggled at high altitudes, plagued by mechanical issues in the cold European skies. The Airacobra, while nimble, lacked the range and high-altitude performance needed for the strategic bombing war. The US needed something different, something durable, something that could take hits and still come home. Enter Republic Aviation. Led by the visionary designer Alexander Kartveli, they dared to think bigger, much bigger. Kartveli believed that survival in the skies required not just speed but power, sheer brute force. So he drew up a fighter that broke all conventions. A massive airframe, built around the largest engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of delivering over 2,000 horsepower. To keep it cool, engineers fitted a massive turbo-supercharger system that required ductwork running the length of the fuselage. It made the aircraft bulky, even awkward in appearance, but it gave it unmatched performance at high altitudes. And then came the firepower. Instead of 2 or 4 machine guns like most fighters carried, the Thunderbolt would bristle with 8 Browning AN/M 2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each burst from a Thunderbolt could unleash nearly 13 pounds of lead in a single second, enough to shred bombers, fighters, and ground targets alike. But when the first prototypes appeared, pilots were skeptical. It was huge, it was heavy. Compared to the nimble Spitfire or the sleek 109, it looked like a flying brick. And in the deadly chess game of aerial combat, appearances mattered. Luftwaffe pilots saw the P-47 and smirked. Too big, too slow, easy prey. They had no idea what was coming. Because this ungainly machine would soon prove that war in the air wasn't just about elegance. It was about endurance, firepower, and the ability to keep fighting when everything else was falling from the sky. The Americans had built a war machine not to outdance the Luftwaffe, but to outlast them. But machines are only half the story. The other half? The men who climbed into the cockpits, strapped into that beast, and learned to fly it into battle. Every war machine is just steel and rivets until a human being climbs inside. For the P-47, its fate would be decided by boys who were barely men, many only 19 or 20 years old, pulled from farms, cities, and small towns across America. They trained in stateside bases under blistering sun, learning to wrestle the heavy jug into the air. The first time most cadets saw the aircraft, their jaws dropped. One recalled in his diary, "She looked like a monster. I remember thinking, how is that thing supposed to fight the Germans? It looked more like a bomber than a fighter." Flying the Thunderbolt required strength and nerve. Its massive engine torque made takeoffs and landings tricky. New pilots often described it as riding a wild bull. Many accidents happened before they even left American soil. But once airborne, something changed. The jug came alive. It was fast in a dive, steady in a climb, and could absorb punishment like no other plane in the sky. By the spring of 1943, squadrons of Thunderbolts arrived in Britain. They were young, untested, and facing an enemy that had honed its craft since 1939. Imagine being 19, barely out of high school, and told, "Tomorrow you silt fly across the channel. You silt meet the Luftwaffe, men with hundreds of kills to their names. Good luck." "Dearest Mary," one pilot wrote in May 1943, "I can hear the engines warming as I write. The jug is heavy and unforgiving, but I feel safer in her than I thought I would. If tomorrow I don't come back, know that I loved you and I believed in what we were doing." When the first Thunderbolts crossed into occupied Europe, nerves ran high, engines roared as the young Americans braced for their baptism of fire. Would their flying jug protect them or betray them? Over France, the Luftwaffe was waiting. The test was about to begin. Spring, 1943. The US 8th Air Force had begun daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe. The stakes could not be higher: cripple German industry or see the war drag on indefinitely. But there was a problem. The bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were being torn apart by swarms of German fighters. Entire crews vanished in flames. The men in those planes begged for better protection. Now protection had arrived in the form of the new P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons, but nobody knew how it would fare against the Luftwaffe. The Germans noticed immediately. The new fighter was enormous, with a hulking fuselage and thick wings. To many Luftwaffe veterans, it looked laughable. One German ace scoffed, "It is no fighter, it is a target." The laughter didn't last long. On their first missions, Thunderbolt pilots struggled. The aircraft's weight made tight turns difficult. Against a nimble Messerschmitt 109, the jug could feel sluggish. Losses were heavy, and whispers spread that the P-47 was a mistake. But then, the Americans learned its secret. The jug was not built to turn, it was built to dive. With its massive frame and turbo-supercharged engine, the P-47 could plummet from the sky faster than anything else. German fighters that tried to follow often lost wings or spiraled into the ground. In those moments, the flying brick became a predator. And when the Thunderbolt's 8 Brownings opened up, the sky filled with fire. A German pilot who survived one such encounter admitted afterward, "It was like flying into a wall of bullets. I had never seen so much firepower from a single aircraft." Suddenly, the joke wasn't so funny. Still, the cost was high. Many Thunderbolt pilots were shot down in these early battles. For the men, every mission was a gamble, courage tested against experience. We lost Jim today. He never saw the 190 behind him. One burst, and he was gone. I keep telling myself the jug can save us, but sometimes I wonder, how many more will it take? As 1943 wore on, the clash intensified. The Americans were learning, the Germans were adapting, and the skies over Europe were becoming a crucible of fire. The war in the air had entered a new phase, and soon the P-47 would reveal a strength that went far beyond speed or firepower, its ability to take punishment and still bring its pilot home. By the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe had become a bloodletting. The US 8th Air Force believed daylight precision bombing could cripple Nazi Germany's war machine. Factories, rail yards and oil refineries were all marked for destruction. But there was one problem. To hit those targets, the bombers had to fly deep into occupied Europe, directly into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. The P-47 Thunderbolt, powerful as it was, still had limited range. It could only escort bombers part of the way. Beyond that point, the flying fortresses were on their own. German fighters waited for them. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose in waves, slashing through bomber formations with ruthless precision. Gunners fought back desperately, but the losses were staggering. On one raid over Regensburg and Schweinfurt in August 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day, over 600 airmen killed, captured or missing. Survivors described the skies as a nightmare of fire and falling bodies. I watched them go down in flames all around us. Whole crews, 10 men each, gone in seconds. We kept flying straight, because if one turned away the fighters would finish them. It felt like suicide. At bases in England, empty bunks told the story. Squadrons returned with half their crews missing. The question loomed, could daylight bombing continue, or was it simply too costly? And for the P-47 pilots, frustration ran deep. They could protect the bombers only part of the way, then had to turn back, leaving their brothers to die. Some pilots wept in silence after landing, ashamed they couldn't stay longer. But even in this dark hour, something remarkable was happening. Reports poured in of Thunderbolts limping home with damage that would have destroyed any other plane. One pilot described his return. They shot my jug to pieces. Holes the size of my fist in the wings, half the tail gone. I thought she sept fall apart, but she brought me back, like she didn't sep want me to die out there. Stories like these began to spread through the airfields. For all its flaws, the jug had one gift above all: it could take punishment and still save its pilot's life. Still, the crisis was real. The losses threatened to break the Allied strategy. Something had to change. The Americans needed not just a tough plane, but a new way to fight. And in the crucible of 1943, that change was coming. Because the Thunderbolt wasn't done proving itself. Its pilots were learning how to turn its bulk into strength, how to wield its 8.50 calibers like a hammer. And soon, the Luftwaffe's laughter would stop for good. By late 1943, the crisis of heavy losses weighed heavily on Allied commanders. Something had to shift. The P-47, once dismissed as clumsy, now had to prove it was more than a stopgap. And so, American pilots adapted. They discovered that the jug's greatest strength lay not in turning fights, but in diving and striking with overwhelming firepower. German pilots might outturn them, but they could not outdive them. At full throttle, a P-47 could plummet at speeds over 500 miles per hour, faster than almost anything in the skies. The tactic became known as boom and zoom. Thunderbolt pilots would climb high above their prey, swoop down in screaming dives, unleash a torrent of .50 caliber fire, and then zoom back up before the enemy could react. The results were devastating. German pilots who had once laughed at the jug now found themselves shredded in seconds. One Luftwaffe ace admitted, "We thought it too heavy to fight. Then we learned it could dive like the devil and spit fire like no other plane." At the same time, engineers improved the Thunderbolt's design. Extended range drop tanks allowed it to escort bombers further, tightening the shield around the lumbering B-17 Southern. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's hunting grounds were shrinking. But the Thunderbolt's evolution didn't stop at the skies. Pilots quickly realized the jug was also a terror against ground targets. With bombs, rockets, and those 8 machine guns, it could turn trains, convoys, and armored columns into twisted wreckage. German soldiers gave it a grim nickname, Der Schlachter, the Butcher. One American pilot remembered strafing a German convoy in Normandy. It was like mowing grass. Trucks exploded, men scattered, and the Jug just kept firing. I almost felt sorry for them, almost. The shift was undeniable. The Thunderbolt was no longer a joke. It was a weapon of fear, a beast in the air, and a reaper on the ground. And with every mission, the Luftwaffe bled more pilots, more planes, more fuel it could not replace. For the young Americans, hope began to flicker. At last, they had a machine that could stand toe-to-toe with the Reich's best. But the fight was far from over. Ahead lay the true test, the brutal winter campaigns, where the Jug would have to not just fight, but lead the charge in breaking Germany's grip on Europe. By early 1944, the Jug had come into its own, no longer dismissed as a lumbering brute. It was now a key instrument in the Allied plan to bring Nazi Germany to its knees, and the plan was as clear as it was brutal. Protect the bombers. Bleed the Luftwaffe. Strangle Germany SIP's war machine on the ground. First, escort. With new drop tanks, Thunderbolts could now accompany bombers further into occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe, once free to tear into bomber streams, now faced swarms of Jug pilots eager for payback. The results were immediate. Veteran German aces who had racked up staggering kill counts suddenly found themselves hunted. The Jug might not turn like a Spitfire, but it could dive, climb, and unleash a wall of lead that turned even the most seasoned Luftwaffe pilots into smoke and wreckage. The trick was discipline. Don't sit dogfight them. Get above, dive, fire, and climb. If you stayed patient, the Jug would do the rest. The second mission, break the Luftwaffe itself. Every time Thunderbolts swept into German skies, they forced the Luftwaffe to rise and fight. And every time they fought, they lost more irreplaceable pilots. By mid-1944, the Jagdwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding out. But it was the third mission that gave the Jug its most fearsome reputation, ground attack. The Thunderbolt's rugged frame, heavy armor, and radial engine made it perfect for the deadly art of close air support. Strafing runs became its trademark. Trains derailed in fiery explosions, fuel depots erupted in black smoke, tanks lay burning on muddy roads. German soldiers came to dread the roar of its engine overhead. Survivors spoke of the panic when the Butcher appeared, its guns cutting through steel and flesh alike. One Wehrmacht diary entry captured the terror. When the Jugs come, there is no cover. Trees, trucks, tanks, all burn. We shoot back, but it is useless. They are like vultures circling until nothing moves. This relentless assault wasn't random. It was calculated, a campaign to cut German supply lines, cripple their mobility, and pave the way for the Allied advance. Every train destroyed meant fewer tanks at the front. Every convoy strafed meant fewer supplies for German soldiers in the trenches. The Jug was not just fighting in the air, it was grinding down the Reich from above. By the spring of 1944, the laughter had stopped. The Luftwaffe knew the Jug was no easy prey, and the German army had learned to fear the scream of its guns. But the Jug's defining moment was still ahead, a test of fire on the beaches and hedgerows of Normandy, where victory or defeat would shape the fate of the entire war. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The greatest invasion force in history surged toward the beaches of Normandy. On that morning, success or failure depended not just on the men storming the sand, but on the control of the skies above them. The Thunderbolt was ready. From the first light of dawn, P-47 squadrons swept inland, hunting German strongpoints, convoys, and artillery positions. They flew low and fast, their 8.50 calibers hammering anything that moved. On the ground, Allied soldiers advancing through the hedgerows quickly learned to love the sound of the Jugset's engine. One infantryman later wrote, "When you cert pinned down by an MG-42 and a Jug screams down and rips it apart, you feel like the whole sky is on your side." German troops, however, knew a different feeling. The roar of a Thunderbolt overhead meant terror. Convoys scattered, tanks abandoned, men diving into ditches that offered no safety. A Wehrmacht soldier diary captured it in stark words. "We march only at night now. In the day, the jugs come. They see everything. They kill everything. The Luftwaffe tried to resist, but by 1944, they were shadows of their former strength. The Jagdwaffe's veteran aces were gone, and their replacements were undertrained and overwhelmed. Against the Jug, they stood little chance. One P-47 pilot recalled, "They came at us desperate, but we were too many. 850s don't give second chances." The reversal was complete. What had begun as a flying joke was now a cornerstone of Allied power. The P-47 dominated not only the skies but the very battlefield below. As the Allies pushed inland, the Jug became their hammer. Bridges collapsed, rail lines vanished, armoured columns burned in the fields of France. German officers complained that they could not move by day without being destroyed from above. The Thunderbolt had done what it was built for, broken the Luftwaffe's back, and butchered the German war machine on the ground. By the time Paris was liberated in August 1944, the verdict was clear. The P-47 was no laughingstock. It was a legend, the aircraft that had turned jeers into fear. But legends come at a price. For every victory there were losses. Brave young pilots who never returned. Their empty bunks a reminder that even the toughest machine could not save everyone. By late 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had written its name into history. It had escorted bombers into the heart of Germany, shattered the Luftwaffe, and turned the roads and railways of Europe into graveyards of steel. But victory came at a cost. Over 3,000 Thunderbolt pilots were killed in action in the European theatre alone. Many died before they ever fired a shot, brought down by flak, mechanical failures, or the sheer chaos of aerial war. One letter from a fallen pilot, mailed just before D-Day, was read to his squadron after his death. "If you stirred hearing this, I didn't stirred make it back. Don't disturb waste your time grieving. The Jug will still fly, and the fight will go on. That said what matters. The rest is just luck." Those words echoed the grim truth. Machines could inspire, but it was men who bore the risk. Yet the Jug also saved lives in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Stories spread of Thunderbolts landing with engines blown apart, wings shredded, even entire control surfaces gone, yet somehow keeping their pilots alive. One survivor recalled limping back after a mission with his plane riddled with more than 200 bullet holes. "She shook, she rattled, but she never gave up. When I touched down, I climbed out and kissed her. That plane saved me." On the German side, the aftershocks were devastating. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, was broken. Its losses in men and fuel could not be replaced. By early 1945, many German units were reduced to flying a handful of sorties, their pilots terrified of the skies dominated by Allied fighters. And for the Wehrmacht soldiers on the ground, the Jug had become a symbol of hopelessness. Veterans later admitted that whenever they heard its distinctive roar, they knew defeat was near. By war's end, the P-47 had flown over 746,000 combat sorties and destroyed more than 86,000 enemy aircraft on the ground, along with thousands of tanks, locomotives and vehicles. Its impact was undeniable. But perhaps its greatest legacy lay not in numbers but in memory. For the men who flew it, the Jug was more than just a machine of war. It was a lifeline, a steel guardian that, for all its bulk and brutality, carried them through hell and back. As peace returned, the P-47 faded from service, replaced by sleeker jets. But for those who knew its power, its toughness, and its terrible beauty, it was unforgettable. The Jug was no laughing matter. It was survival. It was vengeance. It was victory. In the end, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was more than just a warplane. It was a paradox, mocked for its size, feared for its firepower, and loved for its resilience. It carried young men into the crucible of war, and it carried many of them home again. The Germans had laughed when they first saw it. They expected an easy target, a lumbering beast that couldn't possibly stand up to the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But the laughter didn't last, because the Jug fought back with 8 roaring guns, with an engine that refused to quit, and with pilots who learned to wield its weight like a hammer of justice. And that is the legacy of the P-47. Not just in tonnage dropped or enemies destroyed, but in the spirit of endurance it represented. It reminds us that in war, appearances deceive, and sometimes the unlikeliest warrior becomes the deadliest. Even today, when that sound echoes across the sky, it carries more than nostalgia. It carries the memory of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. A reminder of those who climbed into the cockpit, knowing they might never come back, and flew anyway. Their stories and the machines that carried them are not just relics of the past, they are echoes of history, calling us to remember, to reflect, and to learn. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Like, comment, and subscribe to Echoes of WWO, where we bring to life the voices, the battles, and the human stories that shaped our world. Because history is not just dates and machines, it's people, it's sacrifice, and it's the echoes we still hear today. This was the story of the Thunderbolt, the jug that turned laughter into silence, and silence into thunder.